Welcome back. It's me again. How you doing? Hanging in there? I know it's a lot. It's a lot to get through. There's a ton of information coming at you, but the nice thing is you can kind of break it up into chunks and hopefully digest it slowly. Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk about the scoring for Rubric 1. I'm also going to explain what all of these language functions and language demand things are. This is probably the area that our students typically struggle with the most. This whole language function situation is always a bit mystifying. So I'm going to try to demystify it for you and help explain some of these things. So this rubric is based on prompts 4A through D. So the language demands gets its own whole entire question on the edTPA. And this is question for all parts of it. This rubric is really looking at how you identify and support language demands associated with this literacy learning task. What this means is, how are you supporting your students in learning the new language around what you're teaching them? So when you're at this level, this elementary level, every day, your kids are learning new language, new information, new academic ways of talking. And the edTPA has created this question to get you to really think about how you're helping your students gain access to the language that's required in school to be successful. That's the best way that I think I can explain why this is here and what they're really looking at. They want to know, how are you teaching your students to understand the language of school? So this one has an automatic 1 to it. Wait, I think I got to check. Even though I've been doing this and I can talk about it in my sleep, I always have to check and make sure. There is no automatic 1. Just kidding. But this one has so many new terminologies that we need to go over. So language demands is first. That's generally what this question is all about. And these are the ways that academic language is used by your students to participate in the learning tasks that you're teaching them. Language function is the purpose for which language is used generally. The content and language focus of your learning task, also represented by active verbs within your learning outcomes. So what I tell everybody is to look at the strategy that you picked, look at your learning objectives, find a verb that works. Really, this is going to come from your essential literacy strategy. It even says, common language functions in note for the elementary literacy, the language function is often the same verb as your essential literacy strategy. So if you picked identifying the main idea, your language function is identifying. If you picked synthesizing, your language function is synthesizing. If you picked analyzing, your language function is analyzing. If you picked comparing and contrasting, your language function will be comparing and contrasting. So just use your essential literacy strategy. Vocabulary, you all know what this is. These are the words and phrases that are used in your discipline that you're teaching the students. This for you will be both the literacy vocabulary, like the term, the strategy that you're teaching them, and your social studies subject-specific vocabulary. You've got to have both. You need that subject-specific vocab, and you need that general academic vocabulary, like the word analyze, compare, synthesize. Those words are going to be new to your students. Discourse. So discourse is how the members of a discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction using the structures of written and oral language. So, for example, in the School of Education at Nazareth College, you all have learned about the discourse around lesson planning. You know what the term objective is, and you know what content, context, and behavior is in terms of the objective of your lesson plan. You've all learned what the edTPA is and walking through the academic language. These are terms that you probably never used in this context before in your whole life before you got here. we have taught them to you as part of your learning experience in this program to prepare you for what you're going to see in the future. Think of that in the same way for your elementary students. When you're teaching them a lesson on how to synthesize, you're helping them learn the language of how to be a reader. So, what kind of discourse are you teaching your students in order to be successful in other conversations that might happen in literacy later on in their life? That is the discourse, the way that a group of people all talk about a similar thing. And in this case, we're talking about literacy and social studies. Syntax is related more to the rules for organizing the symbols and the phrases and the clauses and the sentences in our language. This one's really appropriate for writing. So I'm going to not really talk about syntax because I don't want you to be led down that path, because all of you are doing comprehension lessons instead of composition. So you're not really teaching a whole lot of syntax in your lessons. We're going to stick with discourse. Language supports are kind of what they sound like: the scaffolds, the representations, the strategies that you're intentionally using to help your learners understand the language. So some people get trapped and they want to repeat the supports that they're providing for their students that we already talked about in rubrics 2 and 3, those good, I'm meeting the goals of my IEPs, and I'm making this modification for my English language learners, and I'm making this modification for my students below grade level. These are different. This is specifically how are you helping your students to learn and practice the language associated with whatever you're teaching them. When do they get an opportunity to talk to each other and to try out the new language? And then how are you supporting them as they do that? Okay, so let's take a look at the prompts and walk through those and how the student responded, and then I'll go through the rubric. So the first question, and this is one where it says, consider the range of students' language assets and needs. Although this is not one of those look out for the IEPs, it is asking you to think about your students' backgrounds, their assets, what they already know, what you know they're struggling with as you think about planning their language. So it's asking you to consider their backgrounds, not their IEPs, those obligations, but definitely their backgrounds. The language function, this one is a one-word answer, and they give you this incredibly unhelpful table, which makes it seem like you got to pick something off this table. You don't got to pick something off this table. The verb for your essential strategy is what you put here. So whatever your essential literacy strategy is, find the verb. That's what you put for your language function. So for this student, of course, it is synthesize. Part B, identify a key learning task. This is a moment in your lesson plans that gives your students opportunities to practice using that language function that you just named in ways that support your essential literacy strategy. And then they want you to identify the lesson in which it occurs, like literally tell the lesson day and the number and tell like exactly where it happens. So this is not talk about how all of your whole lesson provides your students with opportunities to talk. No, they want you to bring them in to one moment where you're showing your students getting to engage with practicing the language function. I encourage all of you to write about lesson 2, because in lesson 1, you're modeling. They don't get to practice anything in lesson 2. In lesson 2, that is the day where you're purposely giving them a chance to try something in a safe space where they're using the rubric, but they're with a friend, or you're still facilitating whole group. You're there to help them talk about day 2. So you can see this person wrote a key learning task that allows them to practice using the new language function of synthesizing is lesson 2 guided practice. And then they go on to explain. In this lesson, students will have already seen me model. They've seen an anchor chart. During guided practice, they will have a chance to work in whole groups as they discuss synthesizing and try out the new language with others. Don't get confused. Don't get led down that path of where they're getting to try the strategy. This is not asking you, where do your students get to synthesize? This question is asking you, where do your students get to try out language related to synthesize? Where do they get to talk about synthesizing and use that new academic language? If you didn't write that into lesson plan 2, write that into lesson plan 2. Go back and revise, or if you're still working on it, put in a moment where they get to have a turn and talk or a quick check-in where they get to say the word synthesize. So this person writes, part of their guided practice is me calling on students to ask them to explain their thinking. As they do, I'm going to ask them to use the new language they've learned for synthesizing. At first I thought, after reading I was thinking, and now I think. So this sentence structure that is the foundation of their anchor chart, of their graphic organizer, everything is tied into this. They're going to get a chance to try that out as a group. This will allow them to practice using the new language function in a well-supported and low-risk way. They'll also be applying the strategy of synthesizing as they do, and that's great. So this is good. This is good. It's not necessarily asking them to use the word synthesize or to explain that, or like turn and talk and tell your buddy what it means to synthesize and say that word. It is having them structure their language around the ability to synthesize. So it's fine. It's a good answer. I would include a moment where the students get to say, synthesizing is, and they have to literally say it out loud to somebody else. That would be directly applying that new language. Okay, then additional language demands. Given the language function of synthesizing and the learning task that you just described, lesson 2, guided practice, describe the following associated language demands, and this can be written or oral, that students need to understand and or use. And then they list these things out. They want you to just talk about these things. Vocabulary or key phrases. This is your vocab words. When do your students get to try out the vocabulary? Where are they learning it? What are the challenges related to this? They want to know, given synthesizing and what you just described above, describe the vocabulary and then at least one of the following. You only have to do one. If you do both, it's not going to move you up in the rubric. This is not one of those ones where if you do both syntax and discourse, it really is only pick the one that's appropriate. You're all going to pick discourse. Syntax, remember, was for writing, works best for writing. Discourse is really good for talking and reading comprehension. So this one gets structured in this way. Given the language function of synthesizing and the learning task of Day 2 guided practice, the students have to understand the specific literacy and social studies vocabulary. So open with the vocabulary. This is the easy one to start with. For the literacy vocabulary, they have to learn the word synthesize. There's going to be an anchor chart to help them do this. The social studies vocabulary, they're going to learn the terms equality, discrimination, segregation. All of those should be in your no box on your lesson plan. And these words are crucial to their understanding of the text. These are probably going to be challenging words for them. Their definitions will be integrated into every lesson. So just a quick description of what vocabulary words are you introducing and how are you doing it, because this might be hard for them. So then you need a paragraph about your discourse demands. So what's going to be hard about the discourse? And in this lesson about synthesizing, that word is going to be tricky for them. So the discourse demands include understanding the language of social studies, including integrating that vocabulary into their discussions, that new vocab, and the language of literacy, including the key details, the background knowledge. Students will be taught a very specific discourse pattern. At first I thought, after reading I was thinking, and now I think. Again, referring to that sentence structure to help them practice the discourse of synthesizing. They'll be able to consider the new discourse as they discuss with their partners or small groups how the content of the text has influenced or changed their perspective during guided practice with a peer and in their written paragraph. During the group discussion at the end of modeling, students will engage in a quick discussion about the word synthesizing, some aspects of it. This will also be assessed in the exit ticket. So It's not the best response because to me, the discourse demands are really understanding and being able to talk about at length what synthesizing means. And I see a repetition of supports that are being provided to help the students with the strategy, not necessarily with understanding the vocabulary. So I think I would build into my lesson to another moment where they get to say what synthesizing is and how it's done to somebody else using the term synthesizing. I don't see the students really being asked to say synthesizing. And I feel like that's what's missing for me in this one. Okay, so then this so far has just been, what's your function? What are the things that are going to be hard about your function? Talk about a moment where your function is taught to the students. What's going to be hard about it with the vocabulary and the discourse? Now they want to know, what are your supports? Identify and describe the planned instructional supports during and or prior to the learning task to help your students understand, develop, and use the identified language demands. And you've got to do all of them: the function, the vocabulary or the key phrases, and the discourse. You can ignore syntax. That's not going to help you if you also talk about that. So you got a lot to do in this response, and it's all related to supports for the language being used, not your teaching supports. Remember, in the last rubric, the student did an awesome job of describing all the good supports that they were providing at the whole class, individual, group level. Not here. This is where you're just talking about language supports. So let's see what they wrote. The planned instructional supports to help students understand, develop, and use, those are 3 different things. The vocabulary and discourse of synthesizing include structured opportunities to engage in dialogue with their peers in the form of talking about their background knowledge and answering the question posed before reading and after reading the text. I don't really remember those as super strong features of the lesson plans. So if I was the scorer, I would go back and see, did the person really do this? Sentence starters are also designed to help them write about what they've read and how their perspective has changed. I do think sentence starters and sentence frames are a great example of a language support because it gives the students the literal language to start the process of synthesizing. During the guided practice, they get to turn and talk about how their background knowledge helps them to answer a question posed by the teacher. This is a low-stake opportunity to try out the language of synthesizing. This is great for everyone to practice. Yes, that's a great example. That one's strong. After reading, so notice it's before, during, and after reading. They will then answer the question again, finding key details and using their sentence frame to organize their thoughts around synthesizing. This structured discussion will not only help them locate key details, but also during the writing portion, they will receive a sentence starter that will support them in using the new language of synthesizing. And then finally, there's an anchor chart on display that's going to remind them of their vocabulary words and their strategy word. And this person also added a bit about the students with IEPs who have additional language supports, because there were some: immediate feedback of the new language used, flexible grouping opportunities, the chance to work with the teacher. So it's a good response. It could certainly be better. There could be more moments where the students get to really engage with each other around the language demands. Let's see how it would score on the rubric. So at a level 3, general supports are planned and described, though they're not in specific detail, for students' application of any 2 or more of the language demands. So the function, the vocab, and or the discourse. Language supports have to go beyond providing opportunities for students to practice the language used and either individually or with other students in the learning segment. Examples of general language supports include describing and defining the function. So that's, the student did that. They got that anchor chart. They're modeling vocabulary. Yep. They're using modeling syntax or discourse. Yep. Providing examples with a little bit of explanation. question and answers about a language demand, whole group discussion of the language demand. We see a lot of that, right? Like the turn and talk and the let's have a discussion about the word synthesizing, providing pictures to illustrate vocabulary. We didn't actually see any of that. And I think that would be helpful. And in fact, if you remember, the anchor chart had that plant that was growing, that could have even been used here. The candidate might inaccurately miscategorize a language demand. So for discourse, I'm going to use sentence frames, and the student did actually kind of do this, and they're saying that that would be more of a syntax kind of support. That's fine, as long as you've got something that's helping your students. So I'm feeling like this level 3 sounds pretty good. Let's look at above. The supports are specifically addressing the language function, vocabulary, and at least one other. So the candidate identifies specific planned language supports and describes how these supports address each of the following. So let's think, did we hear supports for vocabulary? There were, going back, looking at the supports, do we see supports for vocabulary? I see sentence starters. That's not necessarily vocabulary. Here we are. Anchor chart to remind them of the vocabulary words to help them prepare for a discussion. An anchor chart is not a super solid description of a support. How about the language function? Is there a specific support for the language function, which was synthesize? Kind of. There is this language support for the sentence frame. That's kind of being used for the discourse. So do they get a support for synthesizing? I don't really see one. Explaining how their perspective has changed is kind of weak. I don't really see one for synthesizing. And then discourse, we do see the sentence frame. So I'd say there's a kind of a support for vocabulary in the anchor chart. There is that vocabulary bookmark that was not actually described. That should have been described. I don't really see a strong support for that language function of synthesizing, and that's that recurring thing that I was noticing before. And then lastly here, supports are focused to address the specific language demands. We do see sentence starters, modeling for the students, graphic organizers tailored to organize the text. I don't see a super high level of support. I feel like the supports are general, falling here in this category of a 3. So if it was me, I would be scoring this for language demands at a level 3, which is a solid place to be on this. So supports are general, weak supports described in the function. They're not really supported around using that word synthesize. They might get a quick turn and talk, but they don't really get lots of moments to check in and make sure they can explain what it means to synthesize and use that word in a sentence accurately. Okay, so that is how you would score rubric 4, and this student would receive a 3 from me. Come on back and we'll do the last one. We're getting there. We're almost done. Come back for number 5 and we'll talk about the assessment rubric.